Hello, it's me, Christine. Welcome to my little crime corner. We are taking a trip across the pond today, or maybe you're already there, I don't know. According to my analytics, about 22% of you are already there. Our story takes place on July 28th, 1996, when two fishermen had pulled something strange out of the water. Initially, they were excited because of the weight of the catch, as it was much heavier than usual. One of the men, John Kopic, had spent the last 30 years as a fisherman off the coast of Devon, England. He and his friend were in their usual remote fishing area, casting their nets for sea bass, but when they pulled in their nets for the day, something other than fish had been caught. They heaved in the nets only to find that a dead man was among their catch. I'm not superstitious, but I am a little stitious. And apparently a floater is a bad omen, obviously. And the men had to decide whether to hoist the man on board or to cut their nets. They had decided to bring the man on board, which ended up rendering the fish they caught that day condemned, and they lost wages for that day. John had called the Coast Guard and said that a dead man had been pulled up in his fishing nets. The Coast Guard told him to stay put where you are and they would be sending someone right away. Because of the location that the man was found and the state of the body, they had assumed that he was involved in a fishing accident or possibly from an unexpected fall from one of the many nearby cliffs. Because of the condition of the man's body, the forensic pathologist, Dr. Guyan Fernando, had determined that he had been in the water for less than a week. So police had a broad estimate of his time of death. The man appeared to be in his late 40s to early 50s, and he was found wearing a blue and white checkered shirt and green corduroy pants. On his pants, investigators noted that his pockets had been turned inside out. He also had a distinct, kind of snowflake-shaped starflower tattoo on the back of his right hand. Dr. Fernando noted that among several injuries on the body, including several bruises all over his body, notably on his left hip and lower leg, the most prominent injury that he had was a large 4-inch gash on the top of his head. One might surmise this to be potentially the lethal blow, or at least a heavily contributing factor. Although the actual cause of death was determined to be drowning, due to Dr. Fernando finding water in his lungs, it is thought that the head injury sustained rendered the man unconscious. The man didn't have a wallet or any identification on him, but he was wearing a Rolex, specifically an Oyster Perpetual chronometer. This watch needed to be wound as it stopped every 40 hours. It had stopped on the 22nd day of that month, which would have given investigators a timeline to work with, since the watch would have stopped if not continually and regularly wound. Even though the man had no identification on him, luckily Rolex keeps very meticulous records of all of their watches, so hopefully they would be able to track down the watch's owner by the serial number and get an insight on who this man was. So apparently Rolex is able to tell who has owned any given watch at any given time, and every and all service that has ever been performed on the watch. If brought to an authorized Rolex horologist, which according to Rolex's website, every official Rolex jeweler and Rolex affiliate is authorized to receive your Rolex for servicing. After bringing the watch into Rolex to be checked out, they were able to run the serial number and trace the watch back to its owner, a man named RONALD J. Platt. Police reached out to Ronald's next of kin, and his brother was able to positively identify his body. Remember that snowflake star-shaped flower tattoo that was discovered on the back of his hand by Dr. Fernando? Ronald's brother had told police that it was actually a Canadian maple leaf. Ronald was 50 years old, divorced, and worked as a TV repairman. His brother said that the family did not report him missing because they didn't often stay in touch. Scary to think that he might not have been recovered or would have been missing for much longer just because nobody had checked in. If you haven't heard from friends and family lately, check in. Anyway, you don't know someone's circumstances and you don't know their family life. Ronald had been living in a rented house in Chelmsford in Essex County, which was over 300 miles away from where his body was discovered in Devon. On his application for his last apartment rental, he listed a man named David Davis as a reference. David was a financial advisor from Canada that was currently living in England with his wife Noelle and 2 young daughters. The couple had quite a large age gap. David was 50 and his wife Noelle was 21. Detectives then tried to get in contact with David Davis and told them that they had recovered the body of his friend Ronald in Devon. He had expressed very little emotion and did not at all seem surprised. He also asked no questions. He just kind of accepted everything very matter-of-factly. He was almost overly polite with police and offered a lot of details, many unnecessary, like he was talking just to talk. David then told police that he hadn't seen his friend Ronald in over 3 months. David was currently living in the town of Woodham Walter, which was a village in Essex County, 3 miles west of the town of Malden. This is a very small town. There's only 1 school in the town, and it only has about 75 students. Police had only spoke with David on the phone, so they were interested in meeting and speaking with him in person. When they arrived at his home at the end of Little London Farm, there were only 4 houses there, and they actually ended up knocking on the wrong door. An old man had answered the door and told them that they were at the wrong place. He pointed down the street and told them, "That's Little London Farm over there." Police then asked, "Oh, is that where David Davis lives?" And the old man said, "Who?" Police were like, "David Davis. He lives there with his wife and 2 kids. Ring any bells? The old man said, No. No. That's where Ronald Platt and his lovely wife and their 2 little children live. Remember Ronald Platt's brother had already identified Ronald Platt's body? Now we're hearing that Ronald Platt is actually alive and well. Why is David Davis posing as Ronald Platt? Something here is not quite right, to say the least. At this point, as you can imagine, police wanted to look more into David Davis and who exactly was this guy assuming Ronald Platt's identity. Like, what's going on here? Upon investigation into David's background, police found some troubling information. Are you at all surprised? For the last 3 years, all of David's bills were paid by checks and credit cards, which were signed Ronald Platt. More suspicious was that some of the approval slips were signed after Ronald's body was pulled from the water. To see if the 2 men had known each other and this wasn't just a random case of a stolen identity, police were able to confirm that Ronald and David did in fact know each other and found out that David had met Ronald through Ronald's girlfriend, a woman named Elaine Boyes. David had met Elaine at an auction house in 1991, and after striking up a conversation with her, had offered her a job. She accepted and began working for David at the small investment company that he ran in London. Police also found out that David had owned a sailboat, which would give him reason to be in the water. When they tracked down the sailboat, they found that it was actually docked in Devon, only a few miles away from where Ronald was pulled up. Do you see where this is going? Through a search of David's cell phone records, they found that several calls were made from the same area where Ronald was discovered. All of the calls were made during the same time period in July that the medical examiner had said Ronald had drowned. Remember when David said that he hadn't seen Ronald in months? Police had found witnesses that say they saw the 2 of them together in the Devon area not long before Ronald's death. What was the reason David had for being so deceitful? Other than the fact that he assumed his friend's identity and was using Ronald's name to sign bills, detectives had contacted the Essex police and told them to change the charge from check fraud to murder. Wow. On Halloween morning in 1996, an armed response team waited at the end of Little London Farm to arrest David, and right in the middle of the police raid, a taxi had driven down the middle of the road and pulled up right to David's home. David ran outside quickly, slid into the taxi, and told them to step on it, and they began speeding away from the police. Very shortly after, like just a few miles after, a police car catches up with them and pushes the taxi driver over to the shoulder. A policeman gets out of his car, walks up to the window of the taxi with his gun drawn, points it at David's head, and forces him to get out of the car. David was then arrested on suspicion of Ronald Platt's murder. Police went back to the house that David had fled from and found his wife Noelle still there with his 2 small children, 3-year-old Emily and 6-month-old Lily, and police told Noelle what was going on and that David had been arrested. She was to go to the police station, so she was told she could pack a small bag, since she had to take her 2 small children with her, since she had no one in the area that could watch them in the meantime. Noelle packed the diaper bag, and when she handed it to the detective, he recalls being startled by its weight. Suspicious of this, he opened it up and inside found that she had hidden 4,000 pounds and 5 gold bars hidden among the baby clothes. Because of the nature of this find and just the general suspicious way she was acting, as well as the fact that her husband David was just arrested and highly suspected to be Ronald Platt's killer, her purse was searched at the police station. Police could not believe what they found. Inside her purse, she had documents and credit cards with Ronald Platt and his girlfriend Elaine Boy's names on them. She also had birth certificates for her daughters Emily and Lily, but on the birth certificates, Ronald Platt and Elaine Boys were listed as the parents. That's weird. Her explanation for this, which this ought to be good, was that when she was pregnant and needed medical attention, she said that she had used Elaine's name and identification cards in order to get medical treatment. I don't know about that. Police were very suspicious of the couple before because of their large age gap, on top of everything else. They began interrogating her, hoping that she'd slip up from the story she was telling them. They knew something was amiss here. Eventually, she does confess that David is not her husband. He is her father. Excuse me, what? When asked to identify the father of her 2 small children, she refused. While revisiting David's home, police found mountains of evidence. They found envelopes stuffed with American dollars, Swiss francs, British pounds, gold bars, keys to several storage lockers, and many expensive paintings. They also had to sift through hundreds and hundreds of pages of documents that they had found scattered throughout the house. Among the mountains of paperwork, a tiny torn scrap of paper would be a turning point in the investigation. They found a receipt for 7 items from a store in Dartmouth called Sport Nautique. One can surmise that this is a nautical supply store, Sport Nautique. Among the 7 items on the receipt, one of the items was a 10-pound plow anchor. What would that be used for? The police then went back to question John Kopic, who was one of the fishermen that had pulled him in via his fishing net. John said that he didn't notice the anchor at first and only realized it when Ronald had been pulled on board. The anchor was used to weigh down Ronald's body, but it had come loose when he was caught up in the fishing nets. Dr. Fernando was able to pinpoint all the bruises on Ronald's body caused by the anchor. So the anchor would have been attached to Ronald by being tied around his waist or being hooked through his belt. This caused the anchor to knock around his body as the current moved, causing the bruising and lacerations. Detectives then sent Ronald's belt to the forensics lab for testing, as they were able to determine this was the way in which he was killed. The lab technicians were able to find a patch of some sort of translucent material, so they asked a metallurgist if they could identify it. They used a scanning electron microscope to determine that the translucent material was predominantly zinc, which matched the makeup of the anchor. The weight of the anchor would have weighed down Ronald's body significantly, pretty much to the floor. We do know that because of strong currents and the density ratio of the 10-pound anchor being so far underwater would have made movement possible through dragging. As you can imagine, Ronald would not have been able to move very far or very fast. Depending on the water's current, a few feet to a few meters per hour. Now we need to know how Ronald was able to drift over 6 miles out into the English Channel. A man named Bob Allen, who was a hydraulic engineer, studied the current patterns and wanted to find out what the weather and water conditions were in the days leading up and after Ronald's death. This would have given him a relatively precise location of where Ronald entered the water. He knew that the current would have been able to move the body, but would the current itself actually be strong enough without the help of additional work? To test this, Bob did an experiment where he simulated being a man drowning at the bottom of the English Channel. He had attached a 10-pound anchor to his belt, just like the one found with Ronald when he was pulled from the water, and made himself sink to the bottom of his tub of water. His tub of water would have been able to mimic the same currents that would have been present at the same time that Ronald was thrown into the water. Bob's experiment revealed that the anchor held his body firm in one place, meaning that Ronald's body was found in the exact same place it was dumped, 6 miles off the English Channel. Investigators knew that David Davis had the sailboat, called Lady Jane, and brought it in for an inspection. On one of the cushions, they had found a small hair sample, as well as a bag from the sporting goods store where the anchor was purchased. The hair and the bag were then sent out for testing. Forensic technicians were able to pull prints off of the plastic sport nautique bag via superglue fuming, which is heating up a dish of superglue in the chamber with the bag that would have drawn out all moisture and oils to reveal any fingerprints, if any, which in this case, luckily there were. After the superglue fuming process, the bag was then dipped in a yellow fluorescent dye, which revealed the prints on the bag belonged to Ronald Platt. Testing from the small hair sample also came back to belonging to Robert. Lastly, police examined the GPS on the boat, where they were able to find the boat's last location, as it records where it was when last turned off. The test indicated that the system was shut off 3.8 nautical miles from where Ronald had resurfaced on July 20th. If you recall earlier when we were talking about Ronald's watch, we discussed it as being self-winding, meaning that it will run for 40 hours after it stops moving and then has to be rewound again. The watch had stopped on July 22nd, meaning that if it had stopped then, 40 hours earlier would have made the date July 20th, which was the same date as the last recorded stop on the boat's GPS. Also, police were onto the fact that David Davis was not this guy's real name. Who was he and who was he pretending to be all this time? Why was he living with his daughter posing as a married couple with their 2 small children? Who were the daughter's parents? Why did Noelle bother to reveal this during the police interrogation? But why did she not reveal her daughter's paternity? Why did David kill Ronald? Did Ronald know? Questions, questions, questions. Police compared David's fingerprints to known and wanted fugitives from around the world, and they found a match. The prints had matched up with a man named Albert Johnson Walker, who had been on the run for over 6 years. At one point, he had been identified as Canada's most wanted man. Albert Johnson Walker was from Ontario, Canada. He had been married to a woman named Barbara for 22 years, and together they had 4 children. We now know that one of his children, Noelle, his second of 3 daughters, was posing as his wife. Albert Walker had been a high school dropout, originally from Paris, Ontario. He held a series of odd jobs throughout his young adult life before eventually becoming a bank teller for a trust company. He then started filing other people's income tax returns. After becoming well-versed in the trust company, he quit 2 years later to open up his own bookkeeping business called Walker Financial Services, Inc. In a little more than 10 years, his business had opened up 5 additional branches and he had around 30 employees. Things were going well for him in his business until 1986. A stock deal that he had invested in collapsed. It was later revealed that as a mortgage broker and financier, he had defrauded around 70 of his clients to the sum of $3.2 million. Because of this, he had fled to the UK in 1990, along with his 15-year-old daughter, Sheena, who we now know had later gone by Noelle. After coming to the UK, he had changed his name to David Davis and had started up doing the same scams as he was doing in Canada. It was then that he hired Elaine Boyes to be his executive assistant. She was his introduction to Ronald Platt. After telling Elaine that she was no longer needed by him, he had already established a friendship with Ronald, who had confided in him his desire to move back to Canada and to take Elaine with him. Albert had told Ronald and Elaine that he wanted them to be part of his firm. He said that he would help him to get home and actually ended up bankrolling Ronald's trip, but told Ronald that he needed his driver's license along with a signature stamp and his birth certificate for their new business. He was able to convince Ronald to give up all of his information and papers because he didn't want his name attached to the firm because his estranged wife was after him. For whatever reason, this explanation made sense to Ronald and Elaine, and they both agreed. Together, they explored properties all across Europe, even though the company bought none of them. On most of these trips, Albert had asked Elaine to make several large deposits to several foreign bank accounts. It is unknown if Elaine and Ronald knew what they were doing at the time. When Ronald had left for Canada in 1992, he had planned on staying permanently. It was then that Albert had assumed his identity. However, 3 years later, Ronald and Elaine had financial and emotional trouble and split up. At this point, Ronald wanted to return to England. Elaine had come back to England first because she was attending a friend's wedding. She ended up staying and not returning to Canada. Albert had found out that Elaine was back, and after hearing about her and Ronald's split, had persuaded her to give Ronald a second chance and to return to Canada. She was like, no, it's over. At this point, she was just ready to move on with her life. She didn't hear from Albert for over 3 years after that. Ronald was set to return to England, which would expose Albert Walker's identity theft scam, and he couldn't risk being caught. It was then that he devised the plan to get rid of his friend. He bought the 10-pound anchor and concealed it on his boat. He then invited Ronald to take a ride on his boat, where he took him out on the English Channel. Albert then hit Ronald with a blunt object, rendering him unconscious. We know this because there was hair and blood spatters found around Albert's boat. Albert then dragged Ronald to the upper deck, placed the anchor into Ronald's belt, and threw him overboard. Because of the GPS identifying where the boat was, the date and the time, because he didn't remove Ronald's watch, which was easily traced back to him, proved to investigators that Albert Walker had killed his friend. He was charged in 1993 in Canada with 18 counts of fraud, theft, and money laundering. On April 27, 1998, his case was set to go to trial, and on July 6th, later that year, Albert Walker went to trial and pleaded not guilty to the murder of Ronald Platt. His daughter Sheena took the stand and testified against her father, which was an uncommon occurrence. She had said that he had made her lie about who she was and change her identity. After 2 hours of deliberation, he was found guilty of first-degree murder due to the overwhelming evidence that was found on his boat, his home, as well as the whole identity theft thing, and he had received an automatic life sentence. Investigators largely credit Ronald's Rolex for helping to solve the case. If it not for his watch, his identity would have not been known and would have taken a lot more effort to find out who he was, giving Albert more time to clean up for himself or potentially escape. Because of the watch, investigators were able to determine the date and time of Ronald's murder, which pinpointed Albert Johnson Walker as being the killer. On February 22, 2005, Albert Walker was to be transferred to a Canadian prison, where he would face the additional charges of fraud, theft, and money laundering. On July 23, 2007, Albert Walker was sentenced to 4 years for fraud and 1 year concurrent for violations of the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act in Kingston, Ontario. He was serving his life sentence in Kingston Penitentiary, which was a maximum security prison, until the prison closed down in 2013, in which he was moved to a facility in British Columbia. Albert's daughter Sheena has since moved back to Canada with her 2 young daughters, and to this day has not revealed the father of her children. She was not charged in connection with Ronald Platt's murder, and had testified on the stand to an English jury that her father had told her to change her story and lie. As of July 2021, Albert Walker was once again denied parole and is continuing to serve his life sentence in a Canadian prison. I know you're wondering what happened to Elaine. Well, Albert had contacted her just 1 week before police had reached out to her. He was casually talking to her like they were old friends and had made a point to tell her that he was not in contact with Ronald. The intentional lie scared Elaine, so when he had reached out to her a few weeks later asking if they could meet, she was nervous for her safety, but reluctantly agreed. She thought that he might harm her, but she didn't want to raise any suspicion since she was definitely onto him. When they met, he was going on and on with what Elaine described to be a fake and shallow sob story, talking about how devastated he was about Ronald's death. She knew he was guilty, and she called police. So trust your instincts about people, because you can never be too careful. We live in a time now where you can easily share your location with friends and family, so someone always knows where you are, where you're going, and who you're meeting. Just please use your very best judgment. Well, that is all I have for you today. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you learned something, and I will see you in the next one. Bye. Please.
Stella's in the video.